Alright, so we are ready to start working on the torso of the character. And we're going to divide this in two different main parts. One is going to be the spine of the character, and then we'll take care of the neck and head. We're going to focus on the spine for a while because the setup we're going to create is going to take a little bit of time and care to set up correctly. So brace yourselves. This is going to be quite an involved thing. What we're going to do is, traditionally, most rigs for these types of characters rely on a spine setup that uses something called spline IK. And this setup usually involves two different parts: the IK part, which uses the spline IK system, and an FK part that actually drives the IK part. So from a control standpoint, the spine is going to be a traditional FK hierarchy, but this FK system is going to be driving a spline IK setup because the thing that spline IK setups do is they enable you to create some very nice curvature for the spine or any other limb that you decide to use such a system on. So that's what most rigs for bipedal characters use. Now the thing is, Modo does not have a spline IK system. However, we're going to create our own, or as close as we can get to one, which actually the system we're going to use has some nice advantages over traditional spline IK setups. The caveat being that, well, it's spline IK, usually you just set it up by clicking on a button and it's done. Ours we're going to have to build manually, which means it's going to take more time and it's going to take a little bit of care to get up and running. But once it's done, you'll see that it's a really nice system to work with. So let's get started. I'm going to first just prep my workspace. What I'm going to do is create a new workspace to rig on. So let's create a new master workspace. We're going to call this one spine and make it active. So now we have a clean workspace. And I'm also going to hide the rest of the rig so that it doesn't distract us. So I'm going to take the first clavicle and hide it. Let's find the next one, hide that one, and let's hide the legs too. There they are. So now we only have the spine to work with. So in the next video, we're going to start setting everything up. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing we're going to need is a curve for our back. And we're going to draw a curve that starts at the base of the spine and goes all the way to the end of it, to the top. And that curve is the one that is going to be determining how the joints are going to move. So let's start by adding a mesh layer, and let's draw our curve in it. So I'm going to maximize my viewport and go to a side view. Let's go to the left view there. And I'm going to enable snapping, and let's open the options and snap to pivots, because I'm going to snap to the pivots of the objects over here. And let's select our mesh layer and activate the curve tool and start creating our points. Oops, that one slipped because I moved the mouse. It's okay. I'm gonna go back and fix it. There you go. So let's go here and let's say edit, and let's move this guy back. Okay, there we go. Cool. Let's drop the tool. So now we have the curve that we want to use to drive the movement of the joints. To make it easy to see if the curve is actually created properly, I'm going to turn on an active meshes vertices. So we should see our curves verts there somewhere. If you cannot see them, you can just go to vertex subobject mode, component mode, and just check that they were created at the pivot of each joint, which is our case. So we're good to go. Let's check in perspective. We should have a point right there. Oops. Yeah, there he is. Good. I just cannot see it very well. Okay, so we're good. And let's rename the item since we're at it. We're going to call it curve C for center. This time we're going to be working and on the center of the character, obviously. And we're going to call it spine IK curve. Okay? Now, we're going to need a couple of items that we're going to use to deform the curve. As the curve deforms, it's going to move the joints on the spine of the character. Now, normally in other packages, what you do is you can bind the curve to a couple of joints, but in Modo you can't bind curves that way. So we're going to use another feature, which is our weight containers. We're going to use weight containers to deform the curve using a couple of joints. And that's going to provide a nice setup. It has a few advantages that we're going to actually leverage later on to have even more control over how the curve is deforming. So the first thing we'll need is it's our couple of joints that we're going to use. Actually, we're not, well, yeah, joints. I'm calling them joints, but we're not going to use a joint chain. We're going to use locators. So let's create a couple of them. There you go, 2 locators created. And we're going to call this one rig center lower spine deformer, I guess. Rig center upper spine deformer. And we're going to match them to the joints here on the character. So let's search up action to match. So the lower one is going to go at this location, and the upper one is going to go over here. There you go. Now you got to be careful with the upper one to not match it to the neck joint, because that one has a totally different orientation. You want to make sure that both are having the orientation of the spine. So now we're going to graph both of them, and we're going to change their display attributes. I'm going to make them spheres, and we're going to make them smaller. Something like that. All right. Now it's time to set up the deformation system so that we can actually use these guys to deform our curve. So as I said, we're going to use weight containers. So let's just do that. I'm going to create 2 weight containers, one per rig item that we created. So I'm going to go to my curve, go to vertex component mode, select all of them, and come to the deformers tab and say create container, and click again. So we have 2 weight containers, and we're going to rename them. Weight container center upper spine, weight container center lower spine, so that we know what we are driving with each. Let's go back to item mode, and now let's rig everything. So let's go to our workspace. Okay, and we're gonna grab everything we've created and bring it over to the schematic view. So let's see what we have. Here's our weight container for the let's put them matching more or less the layout of the character. Lower spine on the bottom, upper spine over here, and this guy is going to be over here, and this guy's going to be over here. And we're going to create our influences. So let's select our first weight container and say add deform item influences general influence, or you can select it from here too. And we get our first influence, and you gotta make sure you're in setup mode and wire the locator to the effector channel of the influence. And let's do the same for the bottom part. Add deform item general influence, and this guy over there. So we're done. We now have a working spine setup to use with our curve. There's still some stuff we have to do, obviously, but overall, this is the basic idea of it. It's just a couple of containers with their influences, and you'll see what this does. Let's maximize. Let's go back to our viewport. I'm gonna go out of setup mode so we can actually see the deformations happen. So I'm gonna grab the lower spine object and move it, and as you can see, the curve comes with it. Now let's grab the upper one. The curve comes with it. So both are affecting the curve. So that's great. But you'll say, well, yeah, but the curve is moving with both of them like exactly the same amount. We don't have weighting determining how the vertices are going to move all the way down, or vice versa. We're going to do that in a second. There's a couple of ways of doing this. One would be we manually weight the vertices so that they for each container, they weighted appropriately according to the control that is going to be driving them. So what I mean is basically, for example, for the lower spine deformer or control object, I would go to the lower spine weight container and make sure that my weights go from 100 all the way down to 0 over here. So basically you create a weighted ramp of vertex weights, so that when you move that control object, the first vertex moves perfectly with the control object, but all the subsequent vertices move less and less and less until you reach 0, and this one does not move. And we do the same for the upper spine container, but going in the opposite direction. So that way what you get is when you move your control object, you would get a curve that follows that object but decays all the way to the other control objects. So you would be able to use both control objects to drive both ends of the curve. So that's one way of doing it. But we're not going to do it that way. And that would be more or less the effect you would get if you were able to bind the curve over to these locators. We're going to use something different, and we're going to change it later, but you'll see why. What I'm going to use is I'm going to take advantage of Modo's Falloffs, which are quite powerful, and they're going to allow us to create a falloff of weights without having to edit the weights by ourselves. So I'm going to show you how that works. The first thing I'm going to do is create a couple of them. So we're going to add 2 falloff deformers, linear. Let's create one, and let's duplicate it. So we're going to call this, let's say, falloff center upper spine, and this one is going to be falloff center lower spine. And let's go back to setup mode, and we're going to match them again to our joints. So we're going to take the lower spine falloff and match it over here, and as you can see right now it's facing in the wrong direction. So let's correct that. He should be facing in the x-axis, because no, let's actually check. So let's select the joint. Yeah, should be x. So let's grab him again, lower, and let's see. Okay, there you go, x. That's perfect. Okay. Now right now he is a little bit too large, so let's bring the scale back down. The idea is that the falloff will end at the end of the spine, which is here. Right now I'm just eyeballing it, but later on we're gonna get a much more accurate value for this. And the Falloffs tend to be a little bit disruptive when it comes to visuals due to the size of their base. So I'm just gonna scale that down to 5% on, oops, not on X. Like that. Not 50, but 5. There you go. So that's a little bit better. And now we're gonna grab the second one. And we're gonna match this one over here. Oops, upper spine, over here, okay. Same thing. I'm just gonna use X. But this guy, we're gonna rotate it 180 degrees on Y. Actually, it looks like it's rotated already, so. No, not Y, world space. Let's see. Oh yeah, it's on Z. So this guy would be a minus value. There you go. Actually, no, that did not do it. What I'm gonna do is, hold on a second. So we're gonna add 180 to this. There you go. That works. I forgot we can do math operations on the actual values themselves, and Modo will take care of everything. So that's great. And let's also resize him. More or less to this point. And we're gonna do the same thing with its Y and Z values. There you go. Okay. And let's bring those Falloffs over to our schematic. So right now they get connected to the curve, but we're not gonna use that. We're gonna connect them to the influences. So let's bring this guy right here, and this guy right here. And we're going to connect the Falloff over to the Falloff channel on the transform. You get this sort of like weird looking double connection going on, but that's just something Modo does with some tools internally. So don't pay attention to it. Right now our setup is done. And let's see what we got. So if I grab the lower spine deformer, and I move it, you can see that now the bottom end of the curve is sticking over to a control object, but it fades all the way over to the top. And if I grab the upper one, we get exactly the same effect on the other end. So that's great. We don't have to fool around with weighting stuff or anything. And the best thing is, I'm going to show you something, and this is why we are using Falloffs instead of just weighting things manually. I'm going to grab my Falloffs over here. There are certain settings on the Falloff objects that allow us to determine how the curve is going to behave, or how it's going to be deformed by the decay of the Falloff. So the decay is now set to linear, which means that it's going all the way from 0 to 1 or vice versa linearly. And that's why we see a straight line, because it's a perfect decay in both directions. But if we change this, for example, to smooth, now we have this curve that has an ease to it. Okay? And this is something that we can use to further tweak how the spine is going to deform in response to movements on either the hips or the shoulders of the character. So this is really nice. And we can do this without having to weight the curve. And you can experiment with different types of decays on the Falloffs to determine which shape you prefer to use when it comes to deforming your spine. For now, I'm just going to leave it at linear, but we're going to come back to this later on when we continue to experiment with shaping the torso of the character. So for now, this is going to be good. And let's bring this guy back. We're going to have to undo because they were never zeroed out. So let's just undo until he goes back to place. There you go. So we've got our curve already being deformed properly. And now what we have to do is to get the actual joints on the spine to follow that curve. And we're going to do that in the next video. Okay, now we're ready to get that spine moving. And what we're going to do is we're going to take our joints and we're going to path constrain them to the curve. And I know this sounds kind of wacky, but you'll see what this is going to do in a second. So let's find our spine joints. Let's grab this guy. And here he is. We're going to shift select all the way to spine 07, which selects the entire spine. And we're going to control select. Let's make sure that nothing else is selected above. Okay. Let's control select our spine curve. And we're going to constrain them using a path constraint. Now, before you do this, make sure compensation is on. Because if it's not, any object that is constrained to a path in Modo usually, well, not usually, it's always moved to start at the beginning of that path. So you would see all your joints collapse down to the start of the curve, because that's where the start point is. With compensation on, they're going to be able to keep their current positions and still be constrained to the curve. So you want to make sure compensation is on. And now that this is done, everything's okay. We hold down Control to enable multiple mode on the constraint tool, and we just hit path, and they get constrained to the curve. So now, if I grab my locators over here and move them, you'll see your spine move with them. And at this point, you will say, well, you know what? It looks kind of weird because in a spline IK system, your joints will not stretch like that. They will keep their current length, if they were bones, or the distance between joints will be kept uniform or constant as you move the object, and then they will just try to follow the curve. But in this case, they're stretching all the way to the end of the curve. And we probably don't want that to happen. We want them to stay also at a constant length. So we're going to do that as part of our setup. However, I also think that there is value for the rig in being able to stretch the spine if the character would need that to happen. So we're going to keep also the current behavior, and we're going to create a blending system that would allow us to blend between a stretching spine and one that does not stretch. So we're going to do that next. But before moving on, I'm going to create a couple of control objects that will help us deal with the spine a little bit better. But second thought, we'll do that in the next video. All right, before proceeding to create the rest of the setup for the spine, let's create a couple of control objects that will help us better control our spine and have easier access to it. First of all, because we need controls that can easily be grabbed. And second, because remember, we want to keep our rig as separate layers. So these two locators we created that right now are tied to this transform, or these two transforms over here, well, they're on their own layer. They're kind of like deformers. So we want to have a separate layer of controls for this. So let's just do that. Let's create a couple of locators. There you go. We're gonna call one control center shoulders, and the other one is going to be control center hips. Okay, and we're gonna match them to the locators we have already created, but only in position. We don't want to match the orientation. Okay, let's go to setup mode, and let's take the one for the hips, move it over here, and let's take the one for the shoulders and match it over there. Okay, And we're going to change their shapes. We're going to make them boxes. Let's make them smaller for now. But to actually know which size they need to be, I'm going to unhide the character's geometry, because we want to make sure they're easy to select and also don't interfere with the other controls. So let's also unhide the other controls we've created so far for the character. So let's get started with the one for the shoulders. I'm going to make him wider, so he actually goes through the shoulders of the character. And let's make him less tall. Yeah, something like that maybe, and bring it down to probably around there, and maybe a little bit to the back of the character. That just feels about right. Let's do the same for the hips control. It's gonna make him a little bit wider for the hips, and it's fine like that. Also not as tall, and let's bring him down to more or less around there, and let's give them a different color. Let's say what have we not used? We have not used something like this. Let's see what that looks like. Slightly dark. Let's brighten it a little bit. There you go. You can't miss those. Alright, maybe they're too bright. Anyway, you can choose any color you want. I'm just gonna go with something a little bit less exotic. Well, that doesn't really translate very well. But maybe if we make them lighter, that's better. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. So that's it. Now we have to tie the locators that are deforming the spine to these guys. So I'm just gonna collapse all this stuff. So let's go and oh, let's hide the controls too. I don't want to see those for now. There you go. And now we're going to take our locators and constrain them to these new controls. So we're going to select both. Make sure compensation is on because they don't share the same orientation. And we're going to constrain them in position and in rotation. And actually, I should zero out these guys to make sure we're good. And I could also zero out here my two locators. Alright, and now let's constrain him over here, position, and rotation. There we go. So now, when I move these guys, our spine follows. Same when I rotate them. All right. Well, so far so good. So the next step will be to get our constant length system going on. And before I forget, I'm also going to rename these nodes. Transform center. This one is the upper spine. And this one is the lower one. Transform center, lower spine curve. There you go. Now they're properly named. And let's move this a little bit because we have new channels that showed up. There you go. Okay, So we're ready to create the constant length system for our spine in the next video.